Over the weekend, more flooding came to parts of rain-soaked central Texas. This is what it looked like in Kerrville, northwest of San Antonio. Ground search operations were suspended there at one point yesterday because of ongoing flood danger. Rescue teams have been searching for missing people after the central part of the state was ravaged by catastrophic flooding just a week ago. On Friday, President Trump toured some of the devastation. He praised state and local officials for their response, but there is a lot of ongoing criticism over what others say was a failure to get to people fast enough. At a roundtable, the president expressed his shock at the scale of the damage, and he pointed out the perseverance of the victims' families during such a difficult time.
I've seen a lot of bad ones. I've gone to a lot of hurricanes, a lot of tornadoes. I've never seen anything like this. This is a bad one. We just visited with incredible families that, I mean, look, they've been devastated. They lost their child or two children, and just hard to believe what, I've never seen anything like it. A little narrow river that becomes a monster.
A monster, and so many people still just don't have any answers. This morning, at least 170 people are still missing, and every hour that goes by is just torture for their loved ones. At least 132 people are confirmed to have died in the floods since the 4th of July weekend. It's being called a 1,000-year flood, but that kind of scope can be hard to comprehend. Here to offer some context for us is Dr. Hermann Fritz, a professor at Georgia Tech School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Welcome, and thanks so much for being on The Take, Dr. Fritz.
Thank you for having me.
So when you look at the tragic flooding in Texas this month, there is so much to it, and the devastation continues, as we talked about, so many people still missing this morning. But from your perspective, what stands out most?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is that the evacuations were unheeded. There were warnings for the thunderstorms that were incoming, but there was probably an issue on that last mile of communication in terms of actually evacuating people. That is one. And then the other thing that I see is that on these upper reaches, that south fork of the Guadalupe River, the very upper reaches of the river, where the Camp Mystic is, there is basically no river gauge upstream. So we have no way to know exactly how much water is actually coming. We have rainfall gauges upstream on that branch, but we don't have river gauges. So there should probably have been a gauge installed upstream if we're having campers in the flood zone and the floodway. And discussions about sirens have been there. So if we have summer camps like that, then we need to have warning systems that are localized, because the weather forecast is going to be good on a larger scale, on a county level and so forth, but it's not going to be able to pinpoint that thunderstorm and how much rain is going to go exactly in which very small watershed. So that's for the upstream part. And everything downstream really is heeding the warnings, awareness, and evacuation at the right time. Everything downstream really is a last mile management and heeding the warning kind of problem.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking maybe from a parent's perspective, because you were talking about the summer camp right there on the river, and some people looking at FEMA maps that were actually put out a while ago that showed some of those newer cabins were parked right in a known flood area. And as you're talking about having to think about not just a response when you know it's coming, but even thinking about in advance, what would we do if something were to happen? We're talking about this being called a 1,000-year flood. Talk about what you mean by that, and it, you know, obviously it's rare, but how important is it to really plan for what could even be a tiny thought as something that could potentially happen?
Yeah, so 1,000-year flood, right? That is something that, you know, we hear a lot these days, but there's no 1,000-year record, okay? There is no record of rainfall or of floods over 1,000 years. Anywhere in the United States. So basically, those are extrapolations. So typically, those might be a little bit on the high end in terms of saying it's 1,000-year. Chances are that, you know, if you have a 1,000-year or 100-year rainfall every other year, then chances are that the record is just too short. Okay. So when you extrapolate from a short record to a long record, then typically you're going to underestimate the extreme events. That's something we see, for example, for very rare events like tsunamis, where we have literally 1,000-year events. They're just not in the record. And then, you know, you get that Fukushima event that's off the scale and causes hundreds of billions of damage. So that is there. But I think it's a flash flood alley. We knew flash floods are possible. So I think we shouldn't, maybe 1,000 years based on the current record. But if you have a 1,000-year record, I'm very sure that that's not a 1,000-year flood.
Interesting. All right, so you've seen disasters all over the world. What are some of the common infrastructure failures that you've seen repeated over and over again in flood zones? Because the question here is, how do you stop it from happening again?
Yeah, so one of the challenges, of course, in Texas is, and in all the places around the world, actually, where you'd have, dry spells, like those rivers were literally completely dry. A couple of CFS before, and then explosion to 10,000 and even 100,000 CFS in terms of discharge. Is that people are tempted to build in the flood zone because most of the time that flood zone is dry. Okay, so it is very tempting as a developer. Oh well, this is cheap land. It's it's nice and green. It's ready to go, right? It's very tempting to build into those flood zones, and that's something that's happening worldwide. If you go to the Arabian Peninsula and so on, they're even more drier, and then they have a rainfall, right? They have very similar construction issues that they build into those flood zones. And Texas, of course, is the poster child of building into flood zones. We've seen this with Hurricane Hermann in Houston. There have been bayous that have been built out and so forth. And that is a fundamental problem, which is on a planning level, on a state, on a legislative level, and that's where essentially the first mistakes are made.
Sure.
Okay, now obviously one can say that campers should be able to camp on the water because it's recreational. That's what everybody wants. Okay. But if we are doing that in the flood zone, then we need to have ways to warn these people beyond just issuing meteorological warning for thunderstorms, because every time you get that, how often are you actually evacuating, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Hermann, Fritz, we really appreciate the time. These are really important questions as so many people are going through such a horrendous loss there in Texas. We appreciate your context. Thanks so much. We know a lot of people have been asking, how can they help? So our parent company, Tegna, created the Texas Flood Relief Fund to support the communities impacted by the devastating flood. Just scan the QR code that you see right here on your screen to donate. Every dollar that you give goes directly to those in need.